You're listening to the Intrepid radio program with Scotty Roberts. Intelligent talk.
Folks, are we ready? Here we go. Happy Tuesday evening. This is Scotty Roberts. You're listening to the Intrepid radio program right here on the Odyssey Radio Network. That's ODYSY1.com. Come on over. Find out all the different outlets where you can hear this show audibly. And at the same time, check out all the goodness that is Odyssey Radio. And at the same time, while you're listening, you can come on over and you can watch the simulcast video on my YouTube channel. That's youtube.com/Mr. Scotty Roberts. And join the other Intrepids who are watching the show over there and chatting in the live chat room going on right now. Make some friends over there and talk about this show or other stuff. They always get off onto other stuff while the show's going on. But come on over and check it out on my YouTube channel. At the same time, you can see all the former or archived broadcasts of this show over on my YouTube channel. There's nearly 200 of them there. I think there's about 180 of them as of today's show. And you can go down and you can see all the videos for Intrepid Radio program. And you can even see before we started doing Intrepid Radio on Odyssey Radio, all the commentary and the different shows that I was doing at that time. So go over, check out my YouTube channel, and join the live chat during this program. I think you'll enjoy it. Now, we've been talking about Solomon. King Solomon, all the mythology around King Solomon, the legends and the mythology that built up about him. Did he actually possess a ring that gave him power? I know that there are writings in the Jewish Talmud, in the Mishnah and the Mikvah. All these different writings compiled give us tales of Solomon possessing a ring that was given to him by God, more directly by Michael the Archangel, which gave him power. And gave him power over the demonic forces. It's almost a biblical version of what Tolkien later incorporated into his works in The Lord of the Rings, the one ring to rule them all, the ring that gave them power, but at the same time a ring that diminished the, if you would, almost the life force of somebody that was wearing it, because it was using that power. And so we went into all that, we talked about that, and that all started because it was kind of an offshoot of wanting to talk about the Temple of Solomon. Where is it located? I think this is one of history's mysteries. There is this site that we've talked about for the last couple of days that is the traditional site for at least 2,000 years, and that was Herod's Temple, that was built in about 6 or 7 BCE, and was destroyed by the Romans in 70 AD. This is all by way of review for you guys, for anybody that's joining us tonight. Now, Herod's Temple was a reconstruction of Zerubbabel's temple, which was built on the temple site on Mount Moriah after the Babylonian captivity about 450 years earlier. And that temple had been destroyed by the Babylonians when they sacked Jerusalem. And that original site of the temple that the Babylonians destroyed was Solomon's temple, built in or around, started right around 945 to 947 BCE, in the middle of the 10th century. So Herod's temple is really a reconstruction of the second, or a glorification of a municipal and religious expansion and beautification of the second temple. So they call it the third temple. But they say it all took place and that the temple compound was on Mount Moriah, where now there has not been a Jewish temple on that site since 70 AD. We're talking almost 2,000 years since that temple has existed, since it was destroyed. And as the biblical writers said, not one stone was left standing upon another. And that's the temple that was destroyed. Now, not much was going on in Israel after that. I mean, you had the Crusades and all that. You had civilization there. But Israel kind of backed off into the shadows, the diaspora. And so what you've got going on now with the traditional site, back about 1,200 years ago, thereabouts, the Mosque of Omar was built on that site. That is an old building when you look at it. That blue tiled building with the gold dome on it. That is such a visual landmark for looking at the city of Jerusalem now. And that whole compound around it is said to have been roughly the compound of the original Temple of Solomon, the rebuilt Temple of Zerubbabel, and the reconstructed, refurbished Temple of King Herod. Now, there have been, and of course, because of the way Israel was founded as a nation, they are a state, but they were divided. There is the Muslim quarter of Jerusalem, the Jewish quarter, which is basically the old city of David, things like that. There has always been this controversy over that site. Should the Jews, the Israelites who reclaimed Israel, made it a state, be able to rebuild their temple on the traditional site? Well, not as long as the Muslims are there. You can think of the Holy War that would ensue over that. And there's a lot of bloodbathing going on even now over that issue of that site. And nobody's allowed to excavate beneath the site because nobody in the Muslim community, in the hierarchy, wants Israel to be able to claim that site as their own. It's a political thing on top of a religious thing. And so there are some who have looked into this, though, however, and what we've been covering the last couple of days is that maybe the Temple of Solomon and the Temple of Zerubbabel and Herod's temple were located just a hair to the south of what is today the temple compound, the traditional temple compound. And maybe the traditional compound today is actually the remnants, the square or the rectangular foundation of the Roman Antonium, the fortress of the Romans there. And there is a site, they say, where the Antonia stood on the front northwest corner of that site, of the current traditional site, but they say it's too small for the Romans to have been there. So there are theories out there, and there has been some archaeology done, because while they cannot perform any archaeology or excavation work on the traditional Temple Mount, they can outside the mount at the northern tip of the city of David. They've done lots of archaeology there. And they're saying that they're finding remnants of what they believe to be the actual temple site, which would have placed it outside what is now Muslim territory, which they believe the Muslims have built the Dome of the Rock on. Some people believe built it on the foundations of the old Roman fort, not the Temple Mount. And so that's the core of the controversy. Now, I want to show you, yesterday I looked for this and I couldn't find it during the show. I fumbled around. But the first thing I want to show you is a painting of the city of David. Now, this is a painting that was done by a friend of mine. By friend, I mean we know each other, and I purchased some of his, the use of some of his illustrations for a couple of my books. Balaj Ballot is his name, and he's not French. I can't remember what he is, but he lives in Europe. I think he might be French. But Belgian. He's Belgian. And he does a lot of these. You can go to archaeologyillustrated.com, and you can see a ton of his work. He takes biblical archaeology, biblical history, and illustrates it. And this is one of his paintings showing up right here. For those of you listening on the radio, I'm sorry you can't see this. It's a neat painting of the hillside of Judea and the site of the ancient city of David. Now, guys, if you look at this picture, you can see here, I'm going to refer back to this picture from yesterday. It's a modern photograph of the city of of Jerusalem, and you see how Jerusalem extends all the way to the horizon line, way off to the north, way off to the south. Well, this red scrawled circle here is the city of David. That's the original city of Jerusalem that David conquered. And that is now a national park today. Even though people live there, there's shops there, tons of archaeology going on there. They believe they found David's temple. They believe they found the stronghold, the citadel. And now where they believe the temple actually sat, some of these people offering up this new theory, is where you see that big white arrow pointing on the right side of the red scrawled circle, the temple, just to the north of Mount Ophel and just to the north of David's palace and the citadel. And then you've got, of course, over to the right, you see the traditional temple compound, which they're now saying was the Roman fort. Now, you go back to, not that drawing, this one right here, this painting. This shows you a painting of how the city of David would have looked at the time of David and ostensibly during his son, right after him, Solomon. Although there was some expansion and there was girding up of walls and there was filling in of the ravine, things like that was in between the north end of the city and what you see extending up to the temple area. What you see at the top right of this painting is what is considered to be the traditional Temple Mount today. And this is that site on those photographs, the site where now the Dome of the Rock sits. They say this was the highest point, that this is Mount Moriah. And what the alternative theorists are contending, as you see on this picture, I've marked it off, the alternative location of the temple would have been just outside the wall of the old city of David, down in this area. And they've been excavating there, and they've been finding ruins that seem to indicate that there was a temple there. Now, it's inconclusive, but they start digging into history, digging into biblical passages, trying to find out where the temple was supposed to have been built and so on. So this right here, this picture shows you the controversy. You've got the current day traditional Temple Mount up on the top of Mount Moriah, where the Bible says the temple was to be built on Mount Moriah. But the alternatives say maybe Mount Moriah was a little further south of the top of that. It's really big hills is what it is, not real mountains, if you want to call it that. And the old city of David is surrounded by the big ravines or the valleys. In front of you, you've got not the Hinnom Valley. Behind is the valley, the Tyropian Valley, the Valley of the Cheesemakers, and the city would have extended out beyond that a little bit onto the hill in the background during the time of Jesus. And Herod even had his own stronghold built back there. And in the front is not the Tyropian, it's slipping me, the name of the, but in the foreground where you see the trees at the bottom, this is the Mount of Olives, looking back onto the city of David. So this is the illustration I was kind of looking for yesterday. And let me show you one more picture while we're at it. This is a current day model that has been built of Herod's temple. This is how they believe the temple would have looked in the first century. Now, if you look at this, remember I said the current thinking on this alternative temple site is stating that this site where the Dome of the Rock sits is actually, this was all the Roman fort. Now, if you look in this picture, you see off to the upper right, you see that area with the four towers. That is what they, traditionalists say, this was the site of the Roman Antonium. That site off to the north side of the temple. And there's even a passage in the writings of Paul, I think it's in the book of Acts, where he's in the temple and there's confrontation going on, Paul, and it says, and the Roman soldiers descended the steps from the Antonium into the temple compound. So this is what they say was the original Roman fort. And this is what has been believed for 2,000 years about this site. Now they're saying it's off of this picture, off to the left and down the slope a little bit, might be the actual site. And that this picture you see here, the model of the temple in Jerusalem in Herod's time, that this is actually where the Roman Antonium sat. The problem is we can't do any archaeology there. There's no way to verify that this is the site. And I think it's political and deeply religious and all of that stuff. So I want to look at this a little bit more. We were talking yesterday, we kind of left off talking about Ornan, the Jebusite, and how David acquired his threshing floor, which they place on the top of Mount Moriah. that big hilltop where it levels off into a plateau about a third of a mile north of the city. And Scripture records that Solomon built his temple on Mount Moriah and over the threshing floor that David purchased from Ornan. And that's one version of the guy's name, the Jebusite. And the mention here of Mount Moriah and Zion is very important. It shows that these locations are synonymous. This is what the alternative site people are saying. Mount Moriah, Mount Zion are synonymous in the Scripture. That they're synonymous, and it's also the city of David and Zion. And the threshing floor where Solomon built the temple belonged to a Jebusite. Now, the Jebusites were the original inhabitants of the city of Salem that David conquered, renamed it Jerusalem, made it his capital. He also made it the center of cultic worship of Yahweh in Israel. And this fact suggests that it was likely within the borders of the Jebusite city, Mount Moriah, Mount Zion. Now, if this is true, this would place the threshing floor inside the city of David and not on today's Temple Mount. Remember, what they call the Temple Mount today is a third of a mile away from the ancient city walls, up the hill and onto the plateau. So, what's a threshing floor? And this is an area where farmers would separate the grain from the straw and the husks. And this required a surface that was flat, wide open, smooth, and hard. And the International Standard Bible Encyclopedia states this, quote, "The threshing floors are constructed in the fields, preferably in an exposed position in order to get the full benefit of the winds. If there's a danger of marauders, they're clustered together close to the village. The floor is a level, circular area 25 to 40 feet in diameter, prepared by first picking out the stones, then wetting the ground, tamping it or rolling it, and finally sweeping it clean. A border of stones usually surrounds the floor to keep the grain. The sheaves of grain, which have been brought on the backs of men, donkeys, camels, oxen, are all heaped into this area. And the process of tramping out begins on the threshing floor. In some localities, several animals, commonly oxen, donkeys, tied abreast and driven round and round the floor in a circle. In other places, 2 oxen are yoked together to the drag, and the bottom of which is studded with pieces of basaltic stone. This drag on which the driver and perhaps his family sits or stands is driven in a circular path over the grain. And now the surface of the threshing floor had to be flat, it had to be smooth, it had to be hard, and this allowed the oxen to tread the grain. It also has to be in a location where there would be sufficient wind to separate the grain out. And this is the key as it pertains to the temple. They used to throw all the wheat in the air, and the chaff would blow off, and the grain was heavier and would drop to the ground. So most believe that Ornan's threshing floor was under the Dome of the Rock on the traditional Temple Mount. The problem is, as seen in the image I showed you yesterday that's showing the Dome of the Rock, the surface underneath the Dome of the Rock isn't flat at all. And this fact alone makes it highly unlikely that this area served as a threshing floor. I'm going to show you that picture again. Let's see. Beneath the Dome of the Rock is this. If you go inside the Dome of the Rock, this is what you can look at. This is the stone beneath. Now, I will say this. If that entire traditional site, that traditional platform for the Temple Mount, is the site of the Temple Mount, this is a singular rock formation over which they built the Mosque of Omar. They believe that this was the site where Abraham brought Isaac up to sacrifice him to God, and then the angel stops him, and so on. A test of Abraham. I hate that, the whole story of that, but that's another story. Now, the problem with this is this rock, maybe 25 to 30 feet across, or in diameter, does not comprise the entirety of that traditional temple site. There's a lot of flat ground around it. This was one protruding rock structure, and this is where they built the Dome of the Rock. Is it possible that the threshing floor still existed there in all the other flat area around it. That's a possibility. And by the way, today we are going to look into the traditional site and see what the merits are of that. So, something I want to do here, we got about 4 minutes left in this first segment, believe it or not. I want to get into something I talked about in a past series on King David, where I talked about King David, the true life story of a fictional hero, and I dug into all the apologetics about the account of David in the Old Testament. Now, there's something about David having acquired this threshing floor of Araunah, and his other name, I said there was another name, it's Araunah, Araunah, Araunah. And there was a story of a plague that took place in Jerusalem during the time of David. It appears to be no more than an etiology for why the altar was built where it was. Now remember the word etiology, we covered this before. The word etiology simply means the investigation or the attribution of the cause or the reason for something, often expressed in historical or mythological explanations. So this is the etiology of this and the explanation. No such narrative is really required because David, his motivations for building the altar and his choice of the threshing floor of Araunah are logical in and of themselves. You've already seen in the past stuff that we talked about. I'm making reference here to my past radio account. The threshing floor was among the most prominent public spaces in the community, in every community in those ancient times. It needed to be large enough to accommodate a good number of people, for everyone would have been harvesting and threshing at the same time every year. And Araunah, he owned this threshing floor where people would come to have their grain threshed. And it needed to be large enough to accommodate everybody. It also needed to be in a big open space where the wind could blow away the chaff. And for walled cities like Jerusalem, which had been fortified since at least the Jebusite era, and the city of David was a walled city, this meant that the threshing floor would probably, most likely, most logically, be outside the city walls, as Jerusalem was built on a hillside. Now, the natural location for the threshing floor would have been the flat area to the north, and what is now known as the traditional Temple Mount. That would have been the most logical area. Some are placing it with this alternative theory, still outside the northern part of the walls of the city of David, yet in the flat portion there before it slopes up to the top of Mount Moriah and the traditional site. As Jerusalem was built on a hillside, these were the logical spots. And there hardly could be a better location for the altar than the top of Mount Moriah, where the Dome of the Rock sits today. It would have been prominent above the city. It's close to the heavens, as a landscape could allow. And the transformation of agricultural areas into one. Okay, I'm mixing up my words. The transformation of the agricultural area into a cultic worship area would signal that Jerusalem was a distinctively religious center, with enough space to serve the needs of the pilgrims who would come to sacrifice before the ark. And by taking over and repurposing the threshing floor, David made certain that his capital would no longer be an agricultural community, but an urban one, dependent on royal income, both political and sacrificial, rather than on the land. And when we come back, I want to talk a little bit about who Araunah was. And it's going to hail back to the old series I did, but I think this is important to understand in siting the temple. Siting, S-I-T-I-N-G. Siting, laying a site for the temple. So you guys sit tight. We're going to be back in about 2 minutes. Hold on. right, gang, we're back. Thanks for sitting through the break. This is Scotty Roberts. You're listening to my show, the Intrepid radio program, right here on the Odyssey Radio Network. We're listening to fascinating history. I hope this entices you and gets your juices flowing for this kind of historical mystery, even though it's maybe something that you don't think about that much daily. But I hope you're enjoying this. And you're listening right here on the Odyssey Radio Network. That's ODYSY1.com. And you can watch the simulcast in video. Join the live chat room over on my YouTube stream, youtube.com/Mr. Scotty Roberts. Now, we were talking about the traditional temple compound site where the Dome of the Rock sits today. Is this the site where Solomon built his temple? And so we were digging back into how David acquired this site and where it sat. And he purchased it from Araunah, the Jebusite. And this was the man from whom David purchased this property. Most likely he was actually no one at all. Nobody substantial. Though Araunah is commonly understood, even by the biblical authors, as a personal name, it is almost certainly a Hittite title. Urin, meaning Lord. That is, this threshing floor originally belonged to the previous Jebusite ruler of Jerusalem and was sort of a state-owned property. That's what that means. That's when you dig below the surface of the story. He didn't buy it from some local farmer who had set up a threshing floor. It said he bought it from Araunah, which really means the Lord and the Lord of the city. And so it was state-owned property. And if this is the case, then you can almost dismiss the notion that David bought the land from Araunah. This is one of those apologetics that's put into the text. And I thought it'd be fun to recap this for just a few who maybe hadn't heard my series on David. Although the Jebusite community may not have been completely eradicated when David conquered the city, it's certain that the Jebusite ruler would have been subject to David's hungry sword. David probably lopped off his head pretty quickly. So when David began his reign as the new king in Jerusalem, this royal property would have devolved directly to him. And he would have no need to purchase it. It was already his. He conquered the city. He's the king, the new king. And from it's good to be king. And from the perspective of the biblical authors, however, it was important that David purchase the land. This is the apologetic. And this is what we talked about in the series on David. If you ever want to go back and listen to it, these are important things to understand about deciphering biblical history and biblical personages. It was important that David purchase the land. And they depict Araunah as trying to give it to David as a gift. And David refusing, no, I can't just take it from you. I got to pay you for it. And the depth of Israel's connection to the site of its temple was such that no possibility could be allowed for anyone else to make a rightful claim on the property. Now, this is probably some of what you are seeing today with the Islamic site on the traditional site. Why won't they allow archaeologists in there? Why can't it be excavated? They do not want there to be any political controversy as to who actually ancestrally owns that property. And so it's theirs. And the same thing happened in David's time. This same impulse is at the root of the story of Abraham's purchase of the cave of Machpelah in Genesis 23. Whereas in this passage is the first gift that was offered. And the land is fully Israelite, only if the claim to it is undeniable by both its previous and its current owners. And so it was thus very important for the biblical authors to establish and make certain that the site of the altar in Jerusalem on top of Mount Moriah, which would become the site of the temple, was authentically and incontestably Israelite. David, however, would not have to have such qualms. Taking the property of others, as we found when we did this study on it, was never really a problem for David. He claimed what he wanted. The threshing floor of the Jebusite city thus became the cultic center of David's new capital. And it's to this spot that he also relocated the Ark of the Covenant to that spot, protected by its traditional tent. David kept it in the tent, the tabernacle of the covenant, which had been constructed during the time of Moses. And so it had been in existence for about 500 years. And this was that tent. I'm sure it was refurbished over the years, but it was kept in a different city. And David moved that whole kit and caboodle to Mount Moriah, 1/3 of a mile up from the northern wall of his city, Jerusalem, the city of David. And just as the threshing floor was the economic center, now the ark would become the economic centers of David's Jerusalem, a communal space, not only for the surrounding area, but in theory, for the nation as a whole. David was establishing the cultic worship of Yahweh for the first time for the people of Israel in his conquered city of Salem, now Jerusalem, now the city of David. And the establishment of Jerusalem as a religious center may have been a really shrewd economic move on the part of David, but it also served this greater symbolic purpose throughout the entire ancient Near East. The king and the deity were always closely intertwined. You saw it in Moses himself when he said, "No man can see God's face and live. Yet I commune with God face to face as a man talks to his friend." Why did he do that? I believe it's because he comes from an Egyptian background where the pharaohs and the leaders were one with the gods. And so this was being established. David was doing almost the same thing by moving the cultic center of worship of Jehovah to right outside his wall. He was saying, this is the economic center because I'm the king. I am the closest to God. I am appointed by God. And so in Mesopotamia, kings were understood to have been divinely appointed to rule by their gods. They engaged in divine rituals such as the sacred marriage, in which they symbolically slept with a goddess. They're depicted in art as taking the form of a deity. Among the Hittites, the king was also the chief priest of the land. One shrine shows the king being embraced by a god. Now, on his death, the king was said to become a god. In Egypt, the equation was simple. The pharaoh himself was a living god. And such explicit deification was an impossibility in Israelite religion due to the first commandment, due to Jehovah declaring himself the God of Israel and that no man would be his equal. But it would have been natural for David to want to demonstrate God's approval of his reign. The presence of the Ark of the Covenant in his new capital established and accomplished this end. He brought it from the little town where it had been for several hundred years up to Jerusalem. And what we have in David's bringing of the Ark to Jerusalem then is the beginning of Israelite royal theology. And the notion that Israel's king was akin to God's steward on earth. And so this royal theology was being established by David. And he chose the site of Araunah's threshing floor, which we find that if you dig into the language, Araunah means Lord, which probably meant this wasn't an individual other than the king of the city himself that David sacked and took for his own. And it belonged, it was civic community, civically owned land. And of course, David acquired it, but he had to show that this was inextricably his land or the land that God wanted for the temple. And now, as we know, as the story goes on, David wasn't allowed to build the temple. It says that God said to him, you've been a man of blood. You've established the kingdom and so on. I'm going to pass this on to your son. And David really wanted to build the temple. But this was all royal propaganda at its best. An attempt to persuade a defeated enemy that their new overlord came to power by the choice of their own deity. And though there's no reason to doubt that David authentically worshipped the Israelite deity Yahweh in his heart, his possession of the ark in Jerusalem sent much the same message to everybody. So this is, I think, very curious stuff about David, and it's interesting stuff. So we see it makes sense that Oman and his family would place the threshing floor a third of a mile from the fort. Keep in mind that during this time, the traditional Temple Mount contained no walls or defense. It was completely open to attack the top of Mount Moriah. It's far more likely, say the alternative theorists of the location of the temple, that Ornan's threshing floor was within the confines of the old Jebusite city and not on an unguarded hill a third of a mile away, even though that was a little higher ground and you would catch the winds better there. They're saying that this threshing floor most probably existed outside the current walls of the city of David, which makes it just a little closer to the wall of the city. And remember that verse that said, when they built the temple against the walls of the citadel. The citadel, you had the palace, you had the citadel, the northern wall of the city of David, boom. And now they're saying that's where the temple goes instead of a third of a mile up. Now consider the Gihon Spring. And I can tell, folks, we are not going to get through all this material tonight. We'll probably lapse over and do it tomorrow. But because we've only got, what is that, about 15 minutes left. And we're done. But we'll get through as much as we can without rushing it. One of the most compelling reasons for the temple being located within the city of David, and now this is the alternative theory to the traditional Temple Mount site, is the location of the Gihon Spring. And this spring sets along the Kidron Valley near the ancient city of David. And the name Gihon comes from the Hebrew Gihu, meaning gushing forth. And it's one of the world's largest intermittent springs, and it made life possible for ancient Jerusalem while the water from the spring was being used for irrigation in the Kidron Valley. And that's the valley, the name in front of, on the east side of the walls of Jerusalem leading up to the Mount of Olives. And you can see, I'm just going to throw it up here because we're talking about it. The Gihon Spring, of course, emptied into the Pool of Siloam. This is a current-day picture of the Pool of Siloam. You can still visit there today. And it fed the city, and it also fed uphill to the temple, and by the way of the tunnels that they built. So that's the Gihon, or that's the Pool of Siloam and the Gihon Spring. The intermittent spring that constituted Jerusalem's most ancient water supply was situated in the Kidron Valley. That's on the east side, just below the eastern hill of Ophel. Now, let me show you something here. Let's just show this again, just so you get the idea. This, again, is Balazs Balot's illustration of the ancient city of David. Those structures that you see at the very bottom of the picture, center bottom, these are the structures that took the water in from the spring. And down in here is where you also have the Pool of Siloam, a little further down. But this is Mount Ophel, which is up here in the where the Palace of David is, right above it, where the Citadel is north of that, and the alternative location of the temple. So well worth looking at. So this is where the Gihon Spring, and that valley right there, by the way, that valley down front at the bottom, Kidron Valley, Tyropian Valley on the other side, and they were all incorporated into the city. So this is the Mount of Olives. You'd be kind of hovering over here to see this view of the ancient city. And so the Gihon was Jerusalem's most ancient water supply. Without the Gihon, there would have been no Jebusite city on this site for David to even conquer. Jerusalem today would likely not exist without this spring. And the location was on the east of Ophel, which joins the ancient city of David. Now again, this is 1/3 mile from the traditional Temple Mount. Knowing that the Gihon is the only major water source in Jerusalem, does it make sense? Now this is where it becomes a subjective argument. Does it make sense? That is a subjective argument, especially when it comes to history. But does it make sense that Israel would have built their temple a third of a mile away from the only water source on the traditional Temple Mount. And this is especially perplexing, considering the thousands of animals that Israel offered on the Sabbath and the annual feast days, for which thousands of gallons of water are needed. And history says that Rome built aqueducts from Bethlehem to the Temple Mount. And that's about 6-7 miles away, Bethlehem. While this is theoretically could have provided a water source for Herod's temple, it could not have for Solomon's. While there's no evidence of ancient reservoirs underneath the traditional Temple Mount dating to the time of Rome, there's no evidence of a water source prior to Rome's rule. This presents a real problem for the traditional Temple Mount site. There is no source of water, and there's no archaeological evidence leading up to the temple that shows that there was any source of water to it during all the way up to the time of Roman occupation. So they had to have water, thousands of gallons a day coming into the temple compound. Now, this is one of the theories of Pontius Pilate, the Roman governor, procurator of Judea, is that he cut a deal with the Sanhedrin to bring the water supply from the Bethlehem aqueducts straight into the temple complex. Aqueducts above ground. So now you've got to look also now. That was the Gihon Spring. Let's look at the ancient witnesses to the temple location. Now, history speaks of 70 Jewish families who relocated from Tiberias to Jerusalem in the 7th century BCE. Common Era. Tiberias is located in northern Israel along the Sea of Galilee. Ravun Nehammer, in his book Jerusalem Anthology, describes this relocation. Quote, Omar decreed that 70 households should come. They agreed to that. After that, he asked, Where do you wish to live within the city? They replied, In the southern section of the city, which is the market of the Jews. Their request was to enable them to be near the site of the temple and its gates, as well as to the water of Shiloah, or Siloam, which could be used for immersion. Now, this was granted them by Omar, the emir of the believers. Omar was the companion of Muhammad and the second caliph or Islamic leader within Islam. Now, several important points need to be made here. These Jewish families insisted on the southern section of the city, near the pool of Siloam. And there's only one section of Jerusalem that's on the southern portion that contains the pool of Siloam. That's the ancient city of David. The whole city of David was considered to be the southern portion of ancient Israel during the 7th century AD. Now, according to these Jewish families, this was also the area where the temple once stood. This is hard evidence for the temple location within the city of David and not on the traditional Temple Mount. This is evidence from people who gave testimony during the 7th century AD. Now, it also states that water from the pool of Siloam could be used for immersions, which would have included ceremonial washings. What was the water source for the pool of Siloam? The Gihon Spring. Now, if you walk through the Gihon Spring channel underneath the city of David, you can come to the pool of Siloam, as we talked about the other day. And so the fact that the water from the Gihon could be used for ceremonial purposes verifies for some that not all water was equal. It also adds credence to the importance of the Gihon for temple worship. Again, this begs the question why the Jews would have built their temple a third of a mile away from the city walls and from their only water source. Such an idea seems completely preposterous. And now there's a gushing spring. The smoking gun for the temple, as it relates to the Gihon Spring, is eyewitness testimony of a spring-like reservoir within the temple precincts. 2 men provided evidence for this. The first eyewitness to confirm this fact is a man named Arastius, a Jew who lived during the 2nd to the 3rd century BCE. Eusebius, the 4th century church historian, records his account. There's a quote from his account. "There's an inexhaustible reservoir of water, as would be expected from an abundant spring, gushing up naturally from within. There being moreover wonderful and indescribable cisterns underground, of 5 furlongs, according to their showing, all around the foundation of the temple, and countless pipes from them, so that the streams on every side met together. And all these have been fastened with lead at the bottom of the side walls, and over these has been spread a great quantity of plaster, all having been carefully wrought." Now this is Eusebius recording of Erastus's testimony in his chapter 38 of his work. Erastus was an eyewitness to the temple location from the 2nd or the 3rd century BCE, not 2,000 years later like we are, but within 200 to 300 years of the time that the temple actually stood there. And it's important to realize that this was not Herod's temple, but the temple of Ezra and Nehemiah. This is the older temple. Erastus said that there was an inexhaustible reservoir of water, as would be expected from an abundant spring gushing up naturally from within. So the only spring within Jerusalem is the Gihon. If what this eyewitness said is true, the only possible location for the temple would be within the city of David, within the walls of David, and above the Gihon spring. Now, remarkably, Erastus is not the only eyewitness of a spring-like reservoir within the temple area. Tacitus, a Roman historian dating to the 2nd century A.D., now we're talking 1st century was Jesus lived up until the mid-30s of the 1st century. And the Romans destroyed the temple in 70 A.D. in the 1st century. This guy lived, Tacitus, in the 2nd century, within 50 to 70 years of the destruction of the temple. And he describes a similar account. He states, quote, "The temple resembled a citadel, and had its own walls, which were more laboriously constructed than the others. Even the colonnades with which it was surrounded formed an admirable outwork. It contained an inexhaustible spring. There were subterranean excavations in the hill, and tanks and cisterns for holding rainwater, and the foundations of the state had foreseen that the frequent wars would result from the singularity of its customs, and so had made many provisions against the most protracted siege." So before describing what Tacitus saw, it has to be noted that this guy lived nearly 400 years after Erastus, and was not a Jew, but a Roman. He would have also been referring to Herod's temple, not to the temple during the time of Ezra and Nehemiah, which was Zerubbabel's temple. However, even with these differences, both men refer to an inexhaustible spring within the temple. Again, the only spring they could be referring to is the Gihon, because it's the only spring that exists in Jerusalem. And this is the only spring and major water source within the ancient city of Jerusalem. And Tacitus also describes subterranean excavations or tunnels in the hill, along with cisterns for holding rainwater. And this provides additional credibility to the ancient city of David, and not the traditional Temple Mount for the location of the temple. And from the first-hand experience, it's attested that there are many subterranean tunnels and cisterns within the city of David. And the sheer size and number of tunnels are absolutely astonishing. So along with these eyewitness accounts, the small minor prophet book of Joel, chapter 3, verse 18 in the Old Testament, provides a prophetic description of the future temple and shows similar evidence of a spring. It says in the book of Joel, "And it shall come to pass in that day," prophetically, the temple that's not there yet, "that the mountains shall drop down new wine, and the hills shall flow with milk, and all the rivers of Judah shall flow with waters, and a foundation shall come forth for the house of Yahweh, and shall water the valley of Shittim. Now this is a future prophecy of the temple within the millennial kingdom, which is supposed to come after the rapture, after the great tribulation. It's all prophetic stuff. And it's during the millennial kingdom. And Joel confirms that the foundation will spring forth from underneath the temple. In other words, the house of Yahweh. So not only do we see ancient eyewitness testimonies that the temple contained a spring-like reservoir that gushed up from underneath the temple precincts, but a similar account is provided from the prophet Joel as it pertains to the future prophetic temple, which has not yet been built. Now again, these facts present a real problem for those who claim that the temple was on the traditional Temple Mount underneath the Dome of the Rock today. The only way to reconcile the accounts from Erastius, Tacitus, the book of Joel, is to relocate the temple from the traditional Temple Mount site to the Mount Ophel site near the Gihon Spring. Now, tomorrow, I'm going to hit this from another angle. I'm going to show why the traditional site is most probably the actual site. We'll balance it against what we know of this alternative view. Be back tomorrow for that. 23-hour breaks, folks. Break, folks, and we'll be right back. So stay tuned. Thanks for being here. Have a good night.